They told her she was nothing. Born without a wolf in a world that measured souls by the beasts living inside them. They stripped her name from the records, burned her birth cloth, and dragged her beyond the border before she was old enough to understand why. But exile has a way of teaching what kingdoms never could. Silence is not emptiness. It is the sound of everything the powerful refuse to hear. If this story pulls something loose inside your chest, stay until the last word. Hit that like. And drop your city in the comments. Let me see where my people are watching from tonight. The wind came off the Gray Peak Ridge carrying the smell of dead pine and frozen soil, and Alara Vane crouched beside her fire pit blowing life into a pile of bark shavings that refused to catch. Her fingers were cracked at the knuckles. 3 nails on her left hand had split down to the quick from prying ice off the well cover that morning, and the blood had dried in dark lines across her palms like something trying to write a message she could not read. She blew again. Steadier this time. The ember glowed, caught, and a thin ribbon of smoke curled upward through the gap in the roof where the stones no longer met properly. She had packed it twice with river clay. Twice the frost had eaten through. The cabin was not much. 4 walls of stacked pine sealed with pitch and animal fat. A door that swung on leather hinges she replaced every spring. 1 window shuttered with planks she had pulled from a collapsed trapper's blind 2 miles east. The floor was packed earth covered in pelts she had scraped and dried herself. Deer, mostly, and 1 enormous bear hide that had nearly cost her a leg 3 winters back. She sat back on her heels and watched the flame grow. Breathed through her nose. Let the heat reach her face before she moved again. Survival out here was not a philosophy. It was a sequence. Fire first, water second, food when the body demanded it, and sometimes not even then. The Gray Peak wilderness did not care about bloodlines or shifting bonds or the political architecture of the Greyspire Empire sprawled somewhere south beyond the tree line. Out here, the only currency that mattered was whether you could keep yourself alive for 1 more night. Alara had kept herself alive for 11 years. She pulled a dented iron pot from the shelf above the hearth and filled it from the clay jug she kept beside the door. The water was so cold it made her teeth ache when she tested it. She set the pot over the fire and reached for the dried venison strips hanging from a cord near the ceiling. Dinner. Same as yesterday, same as tomorrow. A sound came from outside. Low, thin, barely a sound at all. She stopped chewing, tilted her head toward the door. The wind was steady, not gusting. Whatever she had heard was not a branch cracking or a shutter rattling. It was something else, something alive. She pulled the door open and the cold hit her like a wall. The snow had been falling since afternoon and the clearing around the cabin was buried under a fresh layer that glowed pale blue under the cloud-covered moon. Her breath plumed out ahead of her. She squinted into the dark. Nothing moved. She almost closed the door. Almost. Then she looked down. A wolf pup lay curled against the threshold, tiny, brown, its ribs pressed out against matted fur, and when it lifted its head toward her, its eyes were glassy with exhaustion. Alara exhaled slowly, crouched, extended her hand palm down and waited. The pup sniffed, whined, then pressed its nose into her fingers. Again, she whispered. This was the 4th one this winter. She brought the pup inside and set it on the bear hide near the fire. It was too weak to stand. She warmed water in a small clay bowl and dipped a strip of softened venison into it, then held the strip against the pup's mouth until it began to suck weakly at the moisture. Easy, she murmured. Nobody's rushing you. The other 3 pups were asleep in a pile near the far wall, 2 grays and a black. The black one lifted its head when the new arrival whimpered, stared for a moment, then dropped back down. Pack assessment completed. Threat level non-existent. Alara watched the brown pup eat. She did not ask herself why they kept coming. She had stopped asking that question around the 3rd year. Wolves in the Greyspire territories were bonded creatures, soul-linked to the shifters who carried them. Pups born outside that bond, or separated too young, were considered ferals, worthless, dangerous. Most packs drove them out, and somehow, across miles of frozen wilderness, they found her. The woman born without a wolf. The woman wolves seemed unable to leave alone. She stroked the pup's bony flank and felt the heartbeat beneath the skin. Fast, fragile, fighting. "You're going to make it," she told it. Not a promise, a fact. She would not allow the alternative. 3 days passed. The brown pup recovered enough to stand, to eat on its own, to snap playfully at the black pup's tail. The cabin smelled like wet fur and pine smoke and the iron tang of melted snow. Alara had fallen into the rhythm she always found when new pups arrived, feeding cycles, cleaning the pelts, keeping the fire stoked high enough to maintain warmth without suffocating the small bodies clustered around it. She was outside splitting kindling when the 5th pup came. She heard the sound before she saw anything. A cry so thin and high it cut through the wind like a needle through cloth. She dropped the hatchet and followed it to the edge of the tree line. The pup was silver, not gray, not pale. Silver. The kind of coloring that belonged to one bloodline in the entire Greyspire Empire and one bloodline alone. Crown Pack. Alara stood very still. The pup was lying on its side in a shallow depression of snow, barely breathing. Its coat was matted and crusted with ice. One of its ears had been torn, recently, from the look of the blood still frozen along the edge. And across its small body, she could smell something she had not encountered in over a decade. Alpha musk, deep, ancient, layered with grief so dense it had a texture. She knelt beside the pup and placed her hand on its chest. The heartbeat was barely there. A flutter. A whisper of something that wanted to keep going but had nearly run out of reasons. "No," she said quietly. "Not you." She scooped the pup up against her chest and walked fast back to the cabin. She kicked the door open. The other 4 pups scrambled out of her way as she dropped to her knees beside the fire and cradled the silver body in her lap. The pup was dying. She could feel it. The cold had gone too deep, and whatever had driven it this far north had pushed past every reserve a body this small could carry. Alara did not panic. Panic was a luxury that required someone else to rely on, and she had been the only person in her own life for too long to waste energy on reactions that solved nothing. She stripped off her outer coat and wrapped the pup against her skin, pressing it to her chest where her own heartbeat could reach it. She pulled the bear hide over both of them and lay down beside the fire. "Listen to me," she said against the pup's ear. "You came all this way. You dragged yourself across miles of nothing to get here. You do not get to quit on my floor." The pup did not respond. Its breathing was shallow and irregular, each exhale a little thinner than the last. Alara closed her eyes. She pressed her forehead against the silver fur and did something she had no name for. Something she had done with every pup that arrived broken and terrified at her door. She held still. She breathed steady. She made herself into an anchor, not through power or magic or anything the Empire would have recognized. Just presence, just the unshakable fact of a woman who refused to let go. Minutes passed. An hour. Maybe more. The pup's breathing changed, deepened. The flutter in its chest became a beat, became a rhythm. Alara opened her eyes. The silver pup was looking at her. Its gaze was gold, not the pale amber of most wolf pups. Gold, like someone had poured sunlight into dark wells and sealed it there. "There you are," she whispered. The pup pressed its nose against her throat and exhaled warm air across her skin. Outside, the storm was building. The walls creaked. The wind screamed across the ridge like something angry had been let loose above the mountain. Alara stayed where she was. The fire threw light across the cabin, and the 5 pups settled around her in a loose circle, the silver one closest, its small body finally warm. She slept. Briefly. The kind of sleep that never went deep because the body knew, even in rest, that safety was a temporary arrangement. She woke to silence. Not the silence of a calm night, the silence of something present, something standing outside her door with enough weight and authority to make the wind itself go quiet. The 4 older pups were on their feet, not growling, not cowering, standing at attention, ears forward, bodies aligned toward the door like iron filings drawn to a lodestone. The silver pup in her arms was awake. Its gold eyes were fixed on the door, and against her chest, Alara felt its heart hammering with something that was not fear. Recognition. 3 heavy knocks shook the door on its leather hinges. Alara set the silver pup down gently and stood. She did not reach for the hatchet leaning against the wall, though her hand twitched toward it. Whatever was outside that door was not something a hatchet could address. She lifted the latch and pulled the door open. The man standing in the snow was enormous. Not the broad, undifferentiated bulk of the trappers she sometimes traded with at the river crossing. This was size with architecture, the kind of body built by violence and discipline in equal measure. He wore a black fur-lined coat over dark leather, no insignia, no crown, nothing that announced rank. But rank did not need announcing when it lived in the bones. His face was cut from hard angles, a jaw that looked like it had been set wrong after a break and healed into something more brutal than the original design. Silver hair cropped short against his skull. Not the gray of age, but the true silver that matched the pup lying on the bear hide behind her. His eyes were dark. So dark the iris and pupil merged into one continuous depth that gave nothing away and took everything in. Scars. 3 of them, one across the bridge of his nose, one running from his left ear down beneath his collar, and one on his right hand, the hand resting on the hilt of a blade that looked old enough to have its own history. Behind him, 4 mounted riders waited at the tree line. Their horses stamped and snorted in the cold, and the riders sat rigid with the professional stillness of soldiers who had been ordered to stay exactly where they were. The man looked at Alara. His gaze moved across her face and down to her cracked hands and bare feet and back up again. Something shifted behind those black eyes. Not surprise, not contempt. Something she could not name. "You are Alara Vane," he said. Not a question. His voice matched the rest of him, low, rough, a voice that had spent years giving orders and had forgotten how to ask. "Depends on who is looking for her." "I am." "That does not answer what I asked." The corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile, a fracture in the mask. "Draven Kalor." Alara felt the ground shift beneath her feet, though nothing moved. Draven Kalor. The Alpha King of the Greyspire Empire. The ruler whose name was spoken in whispers even by people who had never been within 100 miles of his fortress. The man they called the Silver Fang. The crownless wolf, the king whose own beast had vanished 7 years ago and who had ruled ever since through nothing but will and the memory of what he had been. He was standing on her doorstep, at the edge of exile, in a storm. "Your guards look cold," she said. "They will survive." "And if they do not?" "Then they were not strong enough to ride with me." She stared at him. He stared back. The wind pushed between them, carrying snow and the smell of pine resin and that same ancient grief she had tasted on the silver pup's fur. "You are here for the pup," she said. "I am here," he said, "because something led me here. I do not yet know what." Kings do not ride into exile territory on instinct. This one does. Behind her, the silver pup let out a sound. Not a whimper, not a growl, something between the two. A noise of desperate, impossible longing. Draven's eyes snapped past Alara to the pup on the bear hide, and what she saw in his face in that unguarded moment was the most terrifying thing she had witnessed in 11 years alone. Hope, raw, unpracticed, corroded by years of suppression, but still there, burning behind the iron discipline like a coal that refused to die no matter how much ash was piled on top. "May I come inside?" he said. The words were stiff, formal, like he had not asked permission for anything in a very long time, and his mouth had to remember how the shape worked. Alara stepped aside. Draven ducked through the doorway. The cabin, which had felt adequate for 1 woman and 5 wolf pups, shrank to nothing around him. His shoulders nearly touched both walls. The ceiling forced his head down. He stood in her home like a siege engine parked in a garden, functionally absurd but impossible to ignore. The silver pup dragged itself across the bear hide toward him, not walking, crawling, its small body shaking with effort, its gold eyes locked on the king with an intensity that did not belong in anything so young. Draven sank to one knee, slowly, like his body had forgotten how to be anything other than vertical, and the descent required negotiation with every joint. The pup reached him, pressed its face into his open palm, and the Alpha King of the Greyspire Empire closed his eyes. Alara watched the man's throat work, watched his jaw clench and unclench, watched the massive hand trembling against the tiny silver body, and she understood something that no exile was supposed to understand, something that no one without a wolf should have been able to read. The pup was not his, but the scent on it was. Whatever connection existed between this dying pup and the most powerful man in the realm, it ran through something buried, something locked away, something that had been sending wolf pups north into the wilderness like messages in bottles thrown from the deck of a sinking ship. "How long has your wolf been gone?" she said. His eyes opened. The look he gave her could have stripped bark from a tree. "That is not public knowledge. I am not public. I am a woman who lives alone in a cabin with a door that barely closes. Your secrets are safe because I have no one to tell them to." Draven stared at her. The pup nuzzled deeper into his hand. The fire cracked and popped in the silence. 7 years, he said finally. 7 years. She let the number sit in the air. And in those 7 years, how many pups has the Empire cast out? I do not track the disposal of ferals. Disposal. The word left her mouth like something rotten. That is what you call it. That is what the council calls it. And what do you call it? He did not answer. He looked at the 4 other pups watching him from the far wall, the 2 grays, the black, the brown. All of them standing, all of them silent. All of them watching the king with the focused attention of creatures waiting for a command no one had given. They are healthy, he said. They are alive. Healthy is a strong word for animals that arrived at my door half dead. You heal them. I keep them warm and I feed them. That is not healing. That is basic decency, which appears to be in short supply in your empire. That fractured almost smile again, quicker this time. You speak to a king the way most people speak to a stray dog. I have more respect for stray dogs. He looked at her then with an expression she had not expected. Not anger, not amusement. Attention, real attention, the kind that came from a man who had spent years surrounded by people telling him what he wanted to hear, and had suddenly found someone who had nothing to gain from lying. The pup will not survive the ride south, she said. Not tonight. Not in this storm. I know. Then what is your plan? I do not have one. He said it flatly, without embarrassment, as if admitting the absence of a plan was no different from noting the weather. I followed the pull. The pull led here. What happens next is not something I have prepared for. Alara crossed her arms. She was barefoot on packed earth, wearing a patched wool shirt and trousers that had been mended so many times the original fabric was a minority opinion. Standing across from the most powerful man in the known world, who was kneeling on her floor holding a dying pup like it was the only thing keeping him tethered to the ground. Then you stay, she said. Tonight. Your guards can shelter in the tree line. There is a rock overhang 50 yards east that breaks the wind. In the morning, if the pup is strong enough, you ride. And if it is not strong enough, then you wait until it is. You are giving orders to the Alpha King. I am giving orders in my home. The fact that you are the Alpha King is your problem, not mine. Draven rose to his feet. The pup whimpered at the loss of contact. He looked down at Alara from a height advantage that should have been intimidating and instead felt like geography, notable but irrelevant to the actual terrain of the conversation. You are not what the records say, he said. The records say I am an omen, a defect, a woman born without a wolf who should have been drowned at birth. Yes. And what do you see? He looked at her hands, the cracked knuckles, the blood under the broken nails, the calluses layered on calluses. He looked at the cabin she had built, the pelts she had scraped, the fire she had kept alive through 11 winters with nothing but her own stubborn refusal to die. I see someone who survived the worst thing my kingdom could do to a person, he said, and came out the other side still capable of keeping things alive. The words hit a place in her chest she had bricked over so long ago, she had forgotten it was there. She did not let it show, could not afford to. Softness in the wilderness was an invitation to be consumed, and she had not survived this long by letting compliments crack her foundation. Send your guards to the overhang, she said. There is venison in the smoke shed if they need it. Draven moved to the door and spoke to the riders in a voice that carried despite the wind. Orders, clipped, absolute. The riders wheeled their horses and disappeared into the trees without a word. He came back inside, closed the door, stood in the center of her cabin like a man who had forgotten what it felt like to be in a space that was not built to contain power. "When did the first pup arrive?" he asked. 3 years ago. A gray female. She came during the first freeze, half-starved, with a broken front leg. "And you took her in?" "I set the leg. I fed her. She stayed." "Why?" Elara looked at him. "Why did I take her in, or why did she stay?" "Both. I took her in because she was dying and I was the only one who could stop it. She stayed because I never gave her a reason to leave." She paused. "The same as the others. They arrived broken. I put them back together. They could leave whenever they wanted. None of them have." Draven's gaze swept the cabin again. The pups, the pelts, the meticulous arrangement of tools and dried food and water stores, everything in its place, everything maintained with the ruthless efficiency of someone who understood that disorder in the wilderness was not inconvenience, it was death. "You built all of this alone," he said. "I had no choice. Most people in your position would have died. Most people in my position did die. I decided not to." He looked at her for a long time. The fire threw shadows across his face that made the scars dance. The silver pup had crawled to his boot and was pressed against the leather, trembling slightly, those gold eyes half closed. "I need to take the pup south," he said. "It carries a scent that should not exist outside the crown pack." "Then you need the pup to survive the night first." "Yes." "Sit down. Eat something. You look like you have been running from something for 7 years and your body has finally noticed." He sat on the floor because there was no chair that would hold him. She handed him a strip of dried venison and a cup of water that was still warm from the fire. He ate without ceremony, drank without pausing. The mechanical consumption of a man who had been feeding his body out of obligation rather than appetite for so long that the act of eating had become purely functional. The pups inched closer, one gray, then the other, then the black, then the brown. They formed a semicircle around the king, not touching, not begging, just present, waiting, as if they had been expecting him and the waiting was finally over. "They do not do this with anyone else," Elara said. She was sitting across the fire from him, her back against the wall, knees drawn up. "Traders pass through once a season. The pups hide when they hear horses. Every time. Without exception. They are not hiding now." "No, they are not." Draven looked at the semicircle of pups. Something moved behind his expression. Something deep and tectonic, like pressure building beneath a surface that had been frozen too long. "My wolf," he started. Stopped. Tried again. 7 years ago, my wolf retreated. After Seraphine died. There one night and gone the next. I have not shifted since." Elara said nothing. She understood the weight of what he was admitting. In the Greyspire Empire, an alpha without a wolf was not an alpha at all. It was the equivalent of a king confessing that his crown was hollow and his throne was held together with rope and habit. "The Empire does not know the full extent," he continued. "They know I have not shifted. They believe it is grief, a choice. They do not know that the connection is—" He stopped again, jaw working. "Blocked, not severed, blocked. There is something between us, a wall I cannot reach through." "A wall made of what?" "If I knew that, I would have torn it down years ago." She watched his face, watched the way his hands had gone still in his lap. The hands of a man who commanded armies and moved nations, now motionless with the helplessness of someone standing on the wrong side of a locked door. "The pups," she said slowly. "Everyone that has come to me carried a trace of something, a scent under the scent. I never had a name for it because I never had a wolf to translate what my instincts were telling me. But it was always the same, always from the same source." Draven's head came up. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that whatever is behind that wall inside you has not been idle. I am saying that wolves do not wander into exile territory by accident. Not once, not twice, certainly not 5 times in 3 years. You think my wolf sent them. I think something sent them. Something that could not reach you, reached me instead. Something that trusted a woman with no wolf to protect what the most powerful empire in the world threw away. The silence that followed was so complete she could hear the snow collecting on the roof, could hear the silver pup breathing against Draven's boot, could hear the fire eating wood, slow and patient and relentless. "That is impossible," he said. "You are sitting on the floor of an exile's cabin in the middle of a blizzard holding a silver wolf pup that should not exist. We passed impossible 3 hours ago." He looked at her across the fire. The mask was gone. Not down. Gone. Stripped away by exhaustion and proximity to the first honest voice he had heard in 7 years. What she saw underneath was not the Alpha King. It was a man who had been drowning in plain sight while his entire kingdom watched and called it ruling. "Come south with me," he said. "Excuse me?" "When the pup is strong enough, come to Greyspire. I am exiled. Your own empire cast me out. I am the empire. I decide who is cast out and who is brought home. And what would I be? A curiosity? A pet healer for your throne room? You would be the woman who can do something no one in my kingdom can do. You would be the woman the wolves trust. Wolves trust me because I am not trying to own them. The moment I walk into your fortress, that changes. I become leverage, currency, something for your council to fight over. My council fights over everything. That is what councils do. And what happens to me when they decide I am a threat?" Draven leaned forward. The firelight caught the scar across his nose and turned it into a line of bright copper. "Nothing happens to you because anyone who touches you answers to me. The protection of a king whose own wolf has abandoned him. Forgive me if I do not find that reassuring." She expected anger, expected the royal temper she had heard stories about, the Alpha King who had once thrown a council table through a stone wall because a general had questioned his judgment. Instead, he exhaled, slow and rough, like a man setting down something he had been carrying for so long his arms had locked. "You are right," he said. "My protection is worth less than it should be. My wolf is gone. My strength is a fraction of what it was. The council knows. They smell the weakness even if they cannot name it. I rule by reputation and memory, and the fact that no one has been brave enough to test the gap between what I was and what I am. Then why would I follow a weakened king into a fortress full of people who want me dead?" "Because," he said, and his voice dropped to something that was barely above the wind, "you are the first person in 7 years who made that pup's heart beat again. And I need to know if you can do the same thing to mine." The fire popped. A log shifted. Sparks climbed into the dark above the flame and disappeared. Alara looked at the man on her floor. She looked at the 5 pups arranged around him like a constellation, whose pattern only she could read. She looked at the silver one pressed against his boot, with gold eyes that held something older than a pup's body should contain. Every survival instinct she had built over 11 years screamed at her to say no, to close the door, to go back to the sequence: fire, water, food, sleep, repeat, and let the king ride south with his broken wolf and his hollow crown and his 7 years of frozen grief. But something else moved beneath the instinct, something she had never been able to name because the world had told her she was born without the equipment to feel it. The pull, the same pull Draven had followed north, the same pull that had been bringing wolf pups to her door for 3 years, the same pull that right now, in this moment, was wrapping around her ribs like a rope tied to something vast and deep and ancient, and it was not asking her to follow. It was telling her she had already begun. "The storm will not break until morning," she said. "There are extra pelts in the corner. The fire needs feeding every 2 hours. If you let it die, I will put you back in the snow myself." "That is not an answer. It is the only one you are getting tonight." She lay down on her side, pulled the bear hide over her shoulders, and closed her eyes. Draven stayed where he was, upright, still, the silver pup sleeping against his hand, the 4 other pups watching him with the patient certainty of creatures that already knew what was coming, even if the humans had not caught up yet. Outside, the storm raged against the mountains. Inside, for the first time in 7 years, the silence that had lived behind the Alpha King's ribs shifted. Not broke, not shattered, not healed, shifted, like something waking up, Something that had been listening through walls of ice and grief and loss for the sound of a voice it recognized. And in the frozen dark, through barriers that should have been impenetrable, buried beneath 7 years of silence so absolute it had nearly become permanent, the wolf stirred. A single pulse, a single tremor of gold behind the black. Then nothing. Draven's hand went to his chest. His fingers pressed against the sternum hard enough to whiten the knuckles. His breath caught. His eyes went wide. Alara did not see it. She was already asleep. But the silver pup saw. It lifted its head, stared at the king's hand pressed against his chest. Then it looked toward the sleeping woman, and its gold eyes burned. Luntz. Part 2. Dawn came gray and mean. The storm had not broken so much as exhausted itself, leaving behind a sky the color of old bruises and a silence thick enough to chew. Alara woke to the smell of smoke and wet fur and something else, something warm and metallic that she associated with large predators and enclosed spaces. Draven had not moved. He was sitting exactly where she had left him, his back against the wall, his legs stretched across the packed earth floor. The silver pup was asleep in the hollow between his thigh and his hip. The other 4 pups were piled against his opposite leg like they had been magnetized there during the night. His eyes were open. She doubted they had closed. "Your fire survived," she said. "I fed it." "Every 2 hours?" "Every hour. I do not do things by half." She sat up. The bear hide slid off her shoulder, and the cold found her immediately, sinking through the wool shirt and settling against her skin like a second garment. She pushed her hair back, dark, tangled, cut short with a skinning knife because vanity required an audience, and looked at the man who ruled the largest wolf-shifter empire in the known world, and had spent the night on her dirt floor without complaint. "The pup," she said, breathing steady, ate once around the 3rd hour. Took water twice. "You watched it eat?" "I watched everything." She crossed the cabin and knelt beside the silver pup, placed her palm flat on its rib cage. The heartbeat was stronger. Not strong, but stronger. The difference between a candle guttering in wind and a candle burning in still air. Still fragile, still temporary, but present. 2 more days, she said, minimum, before this one can handle cold exposure. "I cannot stay 2 more days." "Then leave without the pup." "That is not an option." "Then 2 more days." Draven looked at her. There was a war behind his face. The kind fought between what a king needed to do and what a man could not walk away from. She had seen that war before, in smaller forms, in the eyes of trapped animals deciding whether to chew through their own leg or wait for the trapper. The calculus of loss. What costs more? Staying or going. "One day," he said, "I will send the riders south with a message. Buy time." "Buy time from whom?" "Counselor Verith, my senior advisor. He will assume I am dead if I do not return on schedule, and the things he does with that assumption will be difficult to undo." "Is he loyal?" Draven's mouth thinned. "He is useful. Loyalty is a word people attach to behavior they find convenient." "That is not an answer." "It is the only honest one I have." Alara stood and walked to the door, pulled it open. The air outside was sharp enough to cut, and the snow lay 3 feet deep across the clearing, unmarked except for a single set of tracks leading to the rock overhang where the riders had sheltered. She whistled, 2 short notes, and after a moment a rider appeared at the tree line on a black horse, breath steaming from both human and animal in twin columns. "Your king wants a word," she called out. The rider looked at her the way soldiers looked at civilians who presumed to relay orders, with the particular contempt reserved for messengers who had no rank to justify the message. But he rode forward. Draven appeared in the doorway behind her. He did not step outside. He did not need to. His voice alone was sufficient. "Halsin, take 3 riders south. Inform Verith I am conducting a retrieval in the Northern Territory and will return within 48 hours. Tell him nothing else. If he presses for details, remind him that I do not explain myself to advisors." The rider, Halsin, straightened in the saddle. "And the 4th rider, my king, remains here. Is that wise?" Draven let the question hang in the frozen air. He did not repeat himself. He did not raise his voice. He simply existed in the doorway with the full weight of what he was pressing outward like heat from a furnace, and the rider felt it. Alara watched the man's shoulders drop half an inch. The horse shifted beneath him. 48 hours, Halsin said. My king. He wheeled the horse and was gone. Draven turned back inside. Alara closed the door behind him. Conducting a retrieval, she repeated. Is that what I am? Something being retrieved? Would you prefer I told him the truth? That I followed a feeling into exile territory and found a woman who talks to me like I am furniture? Furniture is useful. Furniture does not argue. Exactly my point. She almost smiled. Caught it. Buried it under the layers of self-preservation she had spent 11 years stacking. Trust was a resource she could not afford to spend on a man she had known for 8 hours, regardless of what he was, especially because of what he was. Kings did not collect strays out of kindness. They collected them because strays were unclaimed, and unclaimed things could be owned cheaply. She knew that math. She had been on the wrong end of it since birth. The day passed in a rhythm that surprised her with its ease. Draven occupied space in the cabin the way a boulder occupied a riverbed, immovable but not disruptive, the flow of her routine simply redirecting around him without friction. She fed the pups. He watched. She restocked the fire. He carried wood from the shed without being asked, splitting logs with the hatchet in the clearing with a mechanical efficiency that suggested he had done physical labor before the crown and had never fully shed the muscle memory. She caught herself watching him swing the hatchet and turned away before the observation became anything more than observation. Midday, the sky brightened briefly. A pale disk of sun behind the clouds that threw no warmth but changed the quality of the light inside the cabin from amber to cold white. Alara heated water and made a broth from dried venison and wild sage she had stored in clay pots against the far wall. She handed Draven a cup without commentary. He drank, paused. This is better than what my kitchen serves. Your kitchen has not been hungry enough to learn what matters. And what matters? Warmth first. Flavor is a luxury that comes after survival. He turned the cup in his hands, large hands, scarred across the backs and the knuckles, the kind of damage that came from decades of hitting things that hit back. You speak about survival the way my generals speak about strategy, like it is the only discipline worth mastering. It is the only discipline that does not lie to you. Power lies. Status lies. The body does not. When you are cold, you are cold. When you are hungry, you are hungry. There is no politics in freezing to death. There is politics in everything. Spoken like a man who has never been outside politics long enough to learn otherwise. He set the cup down, looked at her across the narrow space of the cabin with those black eyes that gave nothing and missed nothing. Tell me what happened when they sent you out. You have my records. Records are what councils write to justify decisions they have already made. I am asking you. Alara leaned back against the wall. The silver pup was in her lap now, dozing. Her fingers moved through its fur in slow, absent strokes that she did not realize she was making. I was 3, she said. Old enough to walk, but not old enough to understand why I was walking away from everything I knew. The Vanes were a minor pack in the Eastern Reach, low status, no influence. When the elders tested me and found no wolf bond, the council gave my parents a choice: abandon the child to the wild or lose their standing in the pack entirely. And they chose their standing. They chose survival. The pack was all they had. Without it, they would have been exiled themselves. 2 adults and a wolfless girl would not have lasted a single winter. So they let you go. They walked me to the border. My mother carried me the last mile because I was too small to move through the snow. She set me down in a trapper's abandoned shelter and told me someone would come for me. Alara's voice did not shake. It did not thin. It delivered the words with the flatness of a woman recounting a supply inventory. No one came. How did you survive? Badly. For a long time. I ate what I could find, roots, bark, insects when the snow melted. A trapper named Osser found me during the first spring and fed me for a season before moving south. He left tools, a knife, a fire striker, the basics. She shrugged. After that, I learned, or I died. Those were the options, and I picked the one that required more effort. Draven said nothing for a long time. The fire spoke for both of them, popping and hissing. My wife died 7 years ago, he said. Not in response to her story, not as a comparison, as an offering, equivalent weight placed on the opposite side of a scale. Elara waited. Seraphine. She was the bond that made the crown bearable, not because she was kind, though she was, because she was the only person who saw me as something other than a function. King, alpha, weapon. She saw the man underneath that, and she stayed anyway. His jaw tightened. When she died, my wolf retreated. Not gradually. Not in stages. One moment the bond was there, the warmth, the presence, the second heartbeat inside my chest that had been with me since I was 12 years old. And the next moment, silence. Absolute. Total. Like someone had sealed a room I had lived in my entire life and removed the door. And you told no one. I told Vareth. He advised me to conceal it, said the council would interpret it as weakness, that rival packs would move against the throne if they knew the Alpha King could not shift. So you ruled without your wolf for 7 years. I ruled on the memory of what I had been, the reputation, the fear, the assumption that if I had not shifted, it was because I chose not to, because I did not need to. His mouth twisted. The truth is simpler. I could not. The wall is there every moment. I press against it and it does not move. I have raged at it, bled for it, spent entire nights on the floor of my chambers trying to reach through, and it gives me nothing, not a sound, not a tremor. He stopped, looked at his hands. Until last night. Elara's fingers stilled in the pup's fur. What happened last night? When you were sleeping. The pup was against my hand and I was listening to the fire and something... He closed his fist, opened it. Something moved behind the wall. For the first time in 7 years, I felt it. A pulse. One single beat, like a fist slamming against stone from the other side. And then? Then nothing. It was gone. Elara looked at the silver pup in her lap. The gold eyes were open now, watching Draven with that ancient, too-knowing gaze. You felt it when you were here, she said. In this cabin. With these pups. With me. Yes. And you felt nothing before. Not in 7 years, not in your fortress surrounded by your entire pack. Nothing. She exhaled. The breath left her lungs carrying something that was not quite fear and not quite recognition, something between the two. The feeling of standing at the edge of a cliff and realizing the wind at your back was not going to stop pushing. You are not here for the pup, she said. I am here for the pup. You are here because of what happened when you were near me. Do not lie to me in my own home. Draven met her eyes. He did not flinch, did not deflect. Whatever instinct governed the man beneath the crown, it was not the instinct for evasion. Both, he said. I am here for both. And Greyspire, you want me to come south because you think I can do something about the wall. I do not think anything. I know what I felt. I know it happened here. I know it has not happened anywhere else in 7 years. I am not a man who ignores evidence because the conclusion is uncomfortable. The conclusion is insane. Sanity is what the powerful decide it is, and I am still powerful enough to decide. The afternoon bled into evening. The sky darkened without ever fully having been light. Elara checked the silver pup's vitals again. Breathing steady, appetite returning, mobility improving. The torn ear was scabbing cleanly. The gold eyes tracked movement with increasing sharpness. Draven stood at the window, looking out through the gap in the shutters at the white emptiness surrounding the cabin. His profile against the dim light looked carved from the same stone as the mountains beyond. If I go with you, Elara said from behind him, I go as what I am. Not as a project, not as an experiment, not as something your council can study and classify. He turned. I go with the pups, all 5. They are mine, and they stay mine regardless of what your empire thinks about feral wolves and the woman who keeps them. Agreed. And I leave when I choose to leave. No locks, no chains, no convenient reasons why the road north is suddenly too dangerous for travel. Agreed. And if your counsel threatens me, I will handle it. Not you, not your guards. Me. I have survived 11 years in a wilderness that kills trained soldiers in 3 days. I do not need a king's protection. I need a king's word that he will not get in my way. Something shifted in his face. Not the crack from before, something wider, deeper. The look of a man who had been speaking a language no one understood for 7 years and had just heard someone speak it back. You have it, he said. Your word. My word. The word of a king whose wolf has been silent for 7 years. The word of the man standing in your cabin who has not lied to you once since he arrived. She held his gaze, measured it, weighed it against every broken promise her life had taught her to expect. The mathematics of trust, cost against probability, against the size of the loss if the bet went wrong. Then she looked at the silver pup. The gold eyes stared back at her, steady, certain, burning with something that did not belong to a pup barely strong enough to walk. Dawn, she said. We leave at dawn. Outside, the lone remaining rider sat his horse beneath the rock overhang, watching the cabin. Inside, the fire burned. The 5 pups slept in a pile against the king's legs, and the woman who had spent 11 years surviving alone began packing supplies for a journey south into the heart of the empire that had thrown her away. She did not think of it as returning. She had nothing to return to. She thought of it as walking forward into something she could not see and could not name, led by the same pull that had been dragging wolf pups across a frozen wilderness to her door for 3 years. The pull that was no longer subtle, the pull that now had a voice. And the voice sounded like the beat of a heart she had never been meant to hear, locked behind 7 years of ice, buried inside the chest of a king who had forgotten what it meant to be whole, reaching through walls that should have been impenetrable with a single impossible message. She is here. She is finally here. And every mile south would bring her closer to the truth that neither of them were ready for, that the conspiracy holding Draven's wolf captive had not been built to contain grief. It had been built to prevent exactly this. Gray Spire Fortress rose from the mountain like a fist punched through the earth and frozen mid-swing. Black stone walls climbed 6 stories into a sky that never seemed to clear above this range, and the towers at each corner were capped with iron that had gone dark with age and weather until they looked less like architecture and more like the exposed bones of something enormous that had died standing up. The main gate was wide enough for 10 riders abreast, flanked by carved wolves the height of 3 men, their stone eyes worn smooth by centuries of wind but still carrying the impression of watching everything that passed beneath them. Alara rode through that gate on a horse she did not own, wearing a coat Draven's remaining rider had given her because her own clothes would not survive the mountain pass, with 5 wolf pups distributed between 2 saddlebags specially rigged to keep them warm during the descent. The silver pup rode against her chest inside the coat. She could feel its heartbeat against her sternum, steady now, strong, faster than her own, but synced to it in a way that made her think of 2 clocks set side by side, gradually falling into the same rhythm. The fortress courtyard was enormous and nearly empty. A dozen soldiers stood at stations along the walls, and their eyes tracked the arriving party with the flat professional attention of men trained to notice everything and react to nothing without orders. Stable hands appeared for the horses. Servants materialized at the edges of the space like shadows given temporary permission to be solid. And at the base of the great staircase that climbed toward the main hall, a man stood waiting, thin, tall, dressed in black robes edged with silver thread that caught the weak morning light and threw it back in cold flashes. His hair was dark and oiled back from a face that had been built for calculation. Narrow eyes, a mouth that rested naturally in a line suggesting neither approval nor disapproval, but the permanent suspension of judgment. His hands were folded at his waist, and his posture communicated patience the way a drawn bowstring communicated patience. Technically, still. Loaded with direction. Counselor Vareth. Draven dismounted and the courtyard changed. Not visibly, not audibly. The shift was atmospheric, a tightening of attention, a collective intake of breath held by every person present as the Alpha King's boots hit stone and his presence expanded outward like a pressure wave. Whatever diminished strength he carried behind the wall where his wolf was trapped, the man still occupied space the way a thunderstorm occupied a valley. You felt him before you processed why. My king! Vareth's voice was smooth and measured, the voice of a man who had spent decades ensuring that every word he spoke arrived precisely where he intended it and nowhere else. The Northern Territory, an unusual destination for a monarch. Unusual destinations produce unusual results. Vareth's gaze moved past Draven to Alara, still mounted, still holding the silver pup against her chest. His expression did not change, but something behind it recalibrated. She could see the machinery working. Assessment, classification, threat analysis, conducted in the space between one blink and the next. "And what result is this?" he asked. "Elara Vane, she is my guest." Vane. The name landed in Vareth's mouth like a stone dropped into still water, ripples spreading. The exile. The woman who has been keeping 5 wolf pups alive in a wilderness that kills soldiers. Yes. The council will have questions. The council can bring their questions to me, not to her. Vareth's chin dipped a fraction, an acknowledgement shaped like a bow but carrying the weight of neither submission nor agreement. He turned and led them up the stairs, and Alara dismounted into the hands of a stable boy who looked at her pups with the wide eyes of someone encountering a creature they had only heard about in cautionary tales. The interior of Greyspire matched its exterior, stone on stone on stone, interrupted by iron fixtures and tapestries so old their colors had surrendered to a uniform gray-brown that made the entire corridor feel like walking through the throat of a sleeping animal. Cold radiated from every surface, not the honest cold of the wilderness, which announced itself and could be planned against, but an institutional cold. The kind that seeped upward from foundations laid by men who believed discomfort was a feature of authority. They passed through a corridor lined with portraits, former kings, former queens, faces painted in the stiff formal style of artists who understood that accuracy was less important than conveying the correct impression. Power, severity, the unbroken chain of alpha bloodlines stretching back further than written record. Alara looked at them and felt nothing. She had never belonged to this history. These faces had authorized her disposal. 2 weeks dissolved into the rhythm of the fortress. Alara was given chambers in the east wing, a suite of rooms larger than her entire cabin, furnished with enough carved wood and upholstered cloth to keep a frontier settlement comfortable for a year. She hated it immediately. The bed was too soft. The air was too still. The walls were too thick, muffling the outside world into a silence that felt less like quiet and more like burial. She kept the pups with her. They explored the rooms with the cautious enthusiasm of creatures testing an unfamiliar environment, sniffing corners, scratching at rugs, establishing territories and hierarchies within the first hour. The silver pup claimed the window seat and sat there for long stretches, staring out at the mountain range with those gold eyes that tracked something Alara could not see. The fortress noticed her. It did not welcome her. Servants were polite in the way people were polite to things they did not understand. Efficient, careful, maintaining exactly enough distance to suggest cooperation without implying acceptance. Guards outside her door were professional and expressionless. The kitchen sent meals she did not request in portions that assumed she had not been feeding herself adequately for a decade, which she supposed was technically accurate but still felt like an insult. And the wolves, the bonded, domesticated, pack-integrated wolves of Greyspire's elite families, reacted to her in a way that nobody had anticipated. They deferred. Not obviously, not dramatically. But when Alara walked the corridors, bonded wolves pressed against their partner's legs and went silent. When she passed through the courtyard, the patrol wolves, enormous gray beasts trained for perimeter defense, lowered their heads, not in fear, not in submission, in recognition, as if something about her presence registered on a frequency they could hear and their human counterparts could not. This did not go unnoticed. The Great Hall of Greyspire was a cavern of black stone and iron chandeliers that had not been lit for a feast in 7 years. Draven held his councils there because the space demanded authority from whoever stood at its head, and authority was the one commodity he could not afford to let slip. The long table could seat 40. 12 chairs were occupied, 11 counselors and the king. Alara was not invited. She found out what happened in the hall the way exiles always found out what happened in halls of power, through the vibrations that traveled outward when powerful men argued behind closed doors. The first vibration came from a maid named Deska, who brought Alara's evening meal with hands that shook slightly and eyes that would not stay still. The council met today, Deska said, not volunteering, confessing. The words pushed out by a pressure she could not contain. Councils meet every day. About you. Councillor Vereth presented a motion to restrict your movement within the fortress. He cited the old exile statutes, exile breach protocols. Exile breach? Alara tested the phrase. I was brought here by the king. The council argues the king exceeded his authority. That exile orders are permanent and require a full council vote to reverse. And what did the king say? Deska's eyes dropped to the floor. The king told Councillor Vereth that if anyone on the council wished to challenge his authority, they were welcome to do so in the traditional manner, on the fighting floor, with witnesses. And nobody accepted. Of course they did not. They will wait. Men like Vereth do not fight. They arrange for others to lose. The second vibration came 3 days later, and it came from the wolves themselves. Alara was walking the lower corridor near the training yards when she heard the sound. A low, sustained howl that did not come from a throat. It came from the walls, from the stone itself. A frequency that bypassed her ears and hit her chest like a struck bell, resonating through her ribs and down into her gut, where it settled and burned. She stopped, pressed her hand flat against the corridor wall. The stone was warm, not from the sun, not from a fire on the other side. Warm the way skin was warm, from something alive underneath. She followed the vibration, down the corridor, through a gate that was not locked because nobody expected anyone to walk this direction voluntarily, down a flight of stairs cut into raw rock, unfinished, without the smooth surfaces of the upper fortress. The air changed, warmer, denser, carrying a mineral tang that tasted like old blood on the back of her tongue. The stairs ended at a chamber, round, low-ceilinged, lit by phosphorescent lichen growing in veins along the walls that cast everything in a pale green light that made shadows look like they were breathing. In the center of the chamber, carved into the floor, was a circle. Not decorative, functional. The lines were cut deep into the stone, 3 inches wide and filled with a substance that was not quite metal and not quite glass. It had the shimmer of something molten that had been frozen at the moment of hardest burn. Runes lined the inner edge, old ones, older than the fortress, older than the empire that had built the fortress. Alara did not read runes. She had never been taught. She had no wolf to translate the instinctive understanding that bonded shifters could draw from their animal halves when encountering the old marks. But she could feel them. Every rune pulsed with a grief so concentrated it had become structural, not emotion, material. Whoever had carved these marks had taken sorrow and compressed it until it became a building block, then used it to construct a cage so thorough that the thing trapped inside it had no walls to beat against because the walls were everywhere. The prison was not a room. It was a condition, a state of being, an atmosphere of loss so complete that the creature inside it could not distinguish between the cage and its own despair. The silver pup had followed her. It stood at the edge of the circle and began to shake. Not with fear, but with a vibration that matched the one in the walls, the one in the floor, the one that had called Alara down these stairs. This is where they put him, she said to no one. To the dark, to the shaking pup, to the wolf buried behind 7 years of manufactured grief. This is not mourning. Someone built this. You should not be here. The voice came from behind her, and she spun. Vereth stood at the base of the stairs. His face in the green light looked like something pulled from deep water. All planes and hollows, the color leached out, the eyes glinting with the flat reflectiveness of a predator assessing whether the thing it had found was food or threat. What is this place? Alara said. Not a question, a demand. A memorial chamber, built after Queen Seraphine's death to honor the bond that was lost. This is not a memorial. Memorials do not have binding runes. Memorials do not pulse with constructed grief. Something moved behind Vereth's calculated stillness. A flicker, gone before she could name it. You read runes? I do not need to read them. I can feel what they do. And what they do is hold something prisoner. You are imagining things. The northern isolation has damaged your perception. This is understandable. The council has noted your instability and... Stop. The word left her mouth with a force that surprised both of them. Not volume, weight. The same quality she had used in the cabin when she told dying pups they were going to survive. The absolute, immovable certainty of a woman who had spent 11 years with nothing to rely on except her own judgment, and had learned to trust it the way other people trusted gravity. I am not unstable. I am not damaged. I am standing in a chamber designed to imprison the Alpha King's wolf, and you know it because you helped build it. Vareth's face did not change. That was how she knew she was right. A man confronted with an accusation he had not expected would react: denial, outrage, confusion. Vereth gave her nothing, and nothing in the language of men who spent their lives managing information meant confirmation. 7 years, she said. His wolf did not retreat from grief. Someone used the grief as a material. Someone carved a binding circle into the heart of the king's own fortress and sealed the bond behind a wall of his dead wife's memory. Her voice was low, but the chamber carried it, every syllable bouncing off the ancient stone and returning to her amplified. He thinks he is broken. He has spent 7 years thinking he lost his wolf because his pain was too great, and the truth is that someone reached into that pain and forged it into chains. You are an exile. Vareth's voice had lost its silk. What remained was colder, harder. The voice underneath the voice, the one that did the actual work, while the polished surface handled appearances. You have no standing, no wolf, no bond. You cannot feel what you claim to feel, and the council will not entertain accusations from a woman who should not exist. The council does not need to entertain anything. The king does. The king will hear what I decide the king hears. That is the function of an advisor: to filter, to protect, to ensure that the throne is not destabilized by every stray who wanders in from the wilderness with a theory and a grudge. He stepped forward. Not much. Enough to close the distance to something that was no longer conversational. You have 2 choices. Return to your chambers and forget this room exists, or continue down this path and discover what happens to people who threaten the stability of the Greyspire Empire. Alara felt her heartbeat in her wrists, in her throat, in the palms of her hands, where the old scars from 11 years of bare survival had left their record. The chamber hummed around her. The runes pulsed, the silver pup pressed against her leg, trembling, its gold eyes locked on Vareth with an intensity that belonged to something far larger and far older than a pup's body. She had 2 choices. He was right about that. Go back. Stay quiet. Accept the boundaries drawn around her by men who had been drawing boundaries around inconvenient truths since before she was born. Survive the way she always had, by making herself small enough to be overlooked. Or stay. Stand in this chamber with its constructed grief and its ancient binding runes and the resonant, suffocating evidence of a conspiracy so vast it had swallowed a king's wolf whole. Stand and fight for a man she barely knew, in a fortress that wanted her gone, against an enemy who controlled the flow of information to the throne itself. The mathematics of survival had always been simple: cost against probability, risk against reward, minimize exposure, maximize control. That math had kept her alive in the wilderness for 11 years. But survival had a limit. There was a point where the cost of staying alive by staying small exceeded the cost of standing up and risking everything. A threshold where the person you had become in order to survive was no longer a person worth keeping alive. Alara looked at Vareth. She looked at the runes carved into the floor by hands that had taken a man's grief and turned it into a weapon. She looked at the silver pup shaking against her leg with its gold eyes full of something that was not fear, but fury. Ancient, patient fury. The kind that waited behind walls of ice for years without fading because it was fueled by something stronger than anger. It was fueled by the knowledge that the wall could be broken, that someone had finally come who could break it. I am not going back to my chambers, she said, and you are going to move. Vareth's eyes narrowed. The green light shifted across his face. The chamber held its breath, and beneath the fortress, beneath the stone, beneath the runes, beneath 7 years of manufactured silence, the wolf slammed against its cage with a force that cracked the floor beneath Alara's feet and sent a tremor through the mountain that every bonded wolf in Greyspire felt in the marrow of their bones. The tremor moved through Greyspire like a living thing. It started in the binding chamber beneath Alara's feet, a crack that split the stone floor from the edge of the rune circle to the far wall in a jagged line that looked like a wound opened by a blade too large to see, and it climbed, up through the foundation rock, through the corridors and staircases and load-bearing walls that had held the fortress upright for centuries. Every chandelier in the great hall swung. Dust fell from joints that had not moved since the mortar was set, and in every corner of the fortress, bonded wolves threw back their heads and howled, not in alarm, not in communication, but in answer, as if something beneath the mountain had called their name and the only possible response was sound. Vareth stumbled. One step back. His hand caught the wall and his composure fractured for exactly long enough to show what lived underneath. Raw, cornered calculation. The look of a man whose architecture was being shaken by a force he had spent 7 years ensuring would never wake. Alara did not stumble. Her feet were planted on cracked stone and her body held the tremor the way a tree holds wind, absorbing it, bending with it, letting it pass through without breaking. The silver pup at her leg had stopped shaking. It was standing now, rigid, its gold eyes blazing in the green phosphorescent light with an intensity that did not belong to anything young or small or fragile. Footsteps above them, heavy, fast, the sound of a man who had felt something impossible and was running toward it rather than away, because running toward impossible things was what kings did when they had spent 7 years on the wrong side of a locked door and suddenly heard the lock click. Draven came down the stairs 3 at a time. His face was stripped of everything except the raw animal underneath. Eyes wide, pupils blown, the muscles in his jaw working like he was chewing through something that had been lodged in his throat for years. His hand was pressed against his chest the same way it had been that night in the cabin, fingers digging into the sternum hard enough to leave bruises on the bone beneath. He stopped at the base of the stairs, looked at the cracked floor, looked at the rune circle pulsing with sick green light, looked at Vareth standing against the wall with his hand braced and his composure in pieces on the ground. Then he looked at Alara. "What is this place?" His voice was not a question. It was a detonation, low, controlled, carrying the compressed force of a man who already knew the answer and needed to hear it spoken aloud so that the knowledge would become real enough to act on. "Ask him." Alara pointed at Vareth. "He built it." Draven's head turned toward Vareth the way a siege weapon turned toward a wall, slow, mechanical, loaded with the promise of absolute destruction. "Draven!" Vareth's hands came up, not surrendering, managing. "This chamber is a memorial, built to honor Seraphine's memory. The runes are traditional mourning marks, nothing more. The woman is an exile with no training and no bond, she cannot interpret what she does not understand." "I felt my wolf." Draven's voice dropped lower, quieter, more dangerous for the quiet. 30 seconds ago. For the first time in 7 years, I felt my wolf hit something from the other side. Not a pulse, not a flicker, a blow. It came from underneath me, from this floor. Grief manifests in many. Do not. One word, 2 syllables, spoken with enough weight to stop a man's lungs mid-breath. Vareth's mouth closed. His throat worked. His eyes, those narrow, calculating, endlessly measuring eyes, darted from Draven to Alara to the rune circle and back, running equations at a speed that would have been impressive if it were not so nakedly desperate. Draven walked to the circle. He knelt at its edge and placed his palm flat on the stone beside the carved lines. His fingers spread wide. His eyes closed. Every muscle in his body went rigid as he pressed his awareness downward, inward, toward the place where his wolf had lived for 30 years before the silence swallowed it. Alara watched his face, watched the concentration-carved lines around his eyes and mouth that made him look 10 years older, watched his breathing shallow and his jaw lock and the tendons in his neck stand out like cables under strain. He was reaching. pushing through whatever remained between him and the thing he had lost. And the effort was costing him. She could see it in the tremor building in his shoulders, in the sweat breaking along his hairline despite the cold, in the way his fingers curled against the stone until the nails scraped. "I can feel it," he said through his teeth. "The wall. It is not grief. It is structured, layered." His eyes opened, and what she saw in them was not confusion. It was the white-hot clarity of a man who had just discovered that the worst 7 years of his life had been engineered. "Someone carved a binding into the foundation of my fortress and used my wife's death to power it." He stood, turned. Vareth had moved toward the stairs. Not obviously, not running, drifting. The subtle repositioning of a man who understood that distance from the blast radius was now a survival priority. 7 years. Draven's voice filled the chamber the way water fills a crack in a dam, relentlessly, finding every gap, pressing against every weakness. 7 years I believed my wolf abandoned me. 7 years I thought the grief had broken something inside me that could not be repaired. I questioned my sanity, my fitness to rule, my right to hold a throne I could no longer defend with the full measure of what I was. He took a step toward Vareth, then another. Each footfall deliberate, each one closing distance that Vareth could not afford to lose. And the whole time, the answer was here, underneath me, carved into stone by someone who knew exactly what they were doing and exactly what it would cost me. "You're making assumptions based on the ravings of a wolfless exile. She is not wolfless. The wolves of this entire fortress defer to her. Every bonded wolf in Greyspire drops its head when she walks past, and you know it because your spies have been reporting it to you since the day she arrived." Vareth's back hit the wall beside the staircase. He had run out of room. The chamber was not large, and Draven had filled it, not just physically, but with something older, something that did not require a wolf to project. The authority of a man who had been betrayed by the person he trusted most to protect him, and had just found the evidence cemented into his own floor. "Who else?" Draven said. "I do not know what you are. Who else on the council knew? Who helped you design this? Who provided the runecraft? Who held my wife's memory in their hands and turned it into a weapon to cage my wolf? Give me names, Vareth. Give me names, or I will pull them out of you the way you pull teeth from a corpse, slowly, with leverage, and without concern for what breaks in the process." Vareth's composure rebuilt itself. Not fully, not convincingly, but enough to function. The way a cracked wall still holds weight until the next tremor. "You want names," he said. "Fine. Counselor Dren, Counselor Halvard, General Morvek." They understood what I understood, that an Alpha King consumed by grief is a liability, that the Empire required stability, and stability required management. Management. You were destroying yourself. After Seraphine died, you did not eat for weeks. You broke 3 doors in the royal wing with your bare hands. You nearly killed a guard captain who delivered a routine report because you heard footsteps that sounded like hers. You were a fire burning out of control, and someone had to contain it before it consumed the throne. So you caged my wolf. I preserved the Empire. You stole the one thing that kept me whole and told me it left on its own. And the Empire survived. 7 years of stability, 7 years without civil war, without succession crisis, without the chaos that comes when an Alpha King loses control and takes his kingdom down with him. You may hate me for what I did. You may kill me where I stand. But the Greyspire Empire is still standing, and that is because of the decision I made in this chamber 7 years ago. The silence that followed was not silence. It was the sound of a man processing the most devastating information of his life and deciding what to do with it, while every molecule of rage in his body demanded immediate, violent resolution. Elara could see the war playing out across Draven's face, the jaw flexing, the veins standing out in his temples, the hands opening and closing at his sides like he was practicing the motion he would need to tear Vareth apart and had not yet committed to executing it. A man with nothing to lose makes decisions faster than a man with everything at stake. That was the calculus that Vareth had miscalculated. He had assumed Draven still had something to protect, a reputation, a position. The careful illusion of strength that had held the throne together for 7 years. But the illusion was gone. The floor was cracked, the runes were exposed, and the man standing in this chamber was no longer the managed king Vareth had spent 7 years maintaining. He was the thing Vareth had been most afraid of. A man who finally understood exactly what had been taken from him and had stopped caring about the cost of getting it back. "Alara," Draven said without turning. "I am here. Can you break it?" She looked at the circle, the runes, the layers of constructed grief humming in the stone like a chorus of the dead. She had no training, no wolf, no bond, nothing that the Empire would recognize as qualification. But she had something else. 11 years of sitting with broken things and refusing to leave until they healed. A patience that was not passive but structural. The patience of a woman who understood that the difference between dying and surviving was not strength, but the willingness to remain present when every instinct screamed to run. "I do not know," she said, "but I know what it feels like. The grief in these runes, it is not his. It was harvested, taken from the moment of greatest pain and compressed into something that could be used as material. If I can reach through it, find the seam between real loss and manufactured prison, I might be able to give his wolf a gap." Might? Might is all I have. Might is all I have ever had. Draven turned to her then. The rage was still there, banked, controlled, redirected from destruction to purpose. His dark eyes held hers, and in them she saw something she had not seen before. Not hope. Hope was what he had shown her in the cabin, raw and corroded and fragile. This was different. This was trust. The specific, terrifying trust of a man handing the most important thing in his life to a woman he had known for less than a month, because every other option had proven to be a lie. "Do it," he said. Alara stepped into the circle. The effect was immediate. The runes flared, not with light, but with sensation. Grief hit her like a wall of black water. Not her grief. Not Draven's grief. Something constructed. Artificial. A perfect replica of loss assembled from real materials but arranged in patterns that served a purpose no natural mourning would ever serve. She felt it slam against her mind and try to reshape her, to convince her that sorrow was the only possible state, that hope was a hallucination, that the weight pressing down on her chest would never lift because it was the fundamental nature of existence. Her knees buckled. She caught herself. Palms flat on the stone, fingers spread, feeling the runes pulse against her skin like a second heartbeat trying to overwrite her own. She had felt this before. Not this specific grief, but this specific mechanism. The overwhelming pressure of a reality trying to crush you into a shape you did not choose. The wilderness had done this. The exile had done this. Every night alone in a cabin with the wind screaming and the fire dying and the absolute certainty that no one in the world knew or cared whether she lived or died. That had been a different kind of prison, built from different materials, but the architecture was the same. And she had survived it the same way she would survive this, by not leaving. She pressed her hands harder against the stone, closed her eyes. Let the manufactured grief wash over her without fighting it, without resisting, without trying to push through. She sat in it the way she had sat beside dying wolf pups in her cabin, present, steady, unmoving, acknowledging the pain without being consumed by it, giving it space without giving it authority. The runes did not know what to do with her. They were built to amplify, to take existing grief and multiply it until the consciousness trapped inside collapsed under the weight. But Alara was not grieving, she was not fighting, she was simply there. A point of stillness in a storm of manufactured sorrow, and the storm could not find purchase on a surface that did not resist. She felt it then. Underneath the layers, beneath the constructed despair and the calculated anguish and the weaponized memory of a dead queen. Something alive. Something enormous. Something that had been pressing against these walls for 7 years with a patience that matched her own, because it had learned the same lesson she had learned, that the difference between survival and surrender was not force but endurance. The wolf, not a concept, not a symbol, a presence. Vast and silver and burning with gold eyes she recognized because she had been looking into their mirror every day for weeks, reflected in the face of a pup that had crawled across a frozen wilderness to find her. She reached for it, not with her hands. with the thing she had no name for, the capacity that existed in the space where a wolf bond should have been, the empty socket that every shifter in the Empire had told her was a defect, a void, a nothing. It was not nothing. It was a doorway, and the wolf on the other side lunged toward it with a force that shattered the first layer of runes like glass breaking under a hammer, sending a shockwave through the chamber that threw Vareth off his feet and drove Draven to his knees and cracked the ceiling in a line that ran from wall to wall above their heads. Elara screamed, not from fear, from the impact. The wolf's presence hit her empty bond space like a river hitting a dry channel, all force and direction and desperate need, filling spaces that had been hollow her entire life with a warmth so intense it burned. Her hands were on fire. Her chest was on fire, her eyes were open, but she could not see the chamber. She could only see silver. A universe of silver and gold, and the shape of something magnificent trapped behind one final wall of ice that was already cracking, already fracturing, already coming apart at the seams because the woman kneeling at the center of the circle was not just breaking the prison from outside. She was giving the wolf a way through. The second shockwave hit, stronger. The rune circle split in half. The phosphorescent lichen on the walls flared bright and died. The floor dropped 3 inches on one side as the foundation shifted. And in the darkness, pressed against stone that was falling apart beneath her, Elara heard it. A heartbeat. Not hers, not the pups, not Draven's, deeper, slower. A rhythm that shook the ground with every pulse, like the footstep of something colossally large approaching from a very long way down. The final wall held, cracked, webbed with fractures that glowed gold in the dark. One more push, one more moment of presence, of patience, of the absolute refusal to leave that had defined her entire existence. But the chamber was collapsing. Stone fell from the ceiling in slabs. The staircase groaned. Dust choked the air. Draven was on his feet, shouting her name through the chaos, his hand reaching into the circle toward her. And Vareth, bloodied, thrown, cornered, was at the wall, his fingers pressed against a rune she had not seen before, a failsafe, hidden in the stone, glowing red beneath his hand. Vareth, Draven saw it too. Take your hand off that stone. If that wolf comes through, everything I built collapses. The council, the structure, 7 years of control. Take your hand off that stone, or I will remove the hand. Vareth looked at Draven across the crumbling chamber, looked at Elara kneeling in the shattered circle with gold light pouring from the cracks beneath her palms, looked at the ceiling coming down around them. You should have stayed broken, Vareth said. He pressed the rune. The chamber went white. The white lasted 3 seconds. Maybe 4. Long enough for the concussive force of the failsafe rune to blow the remaining lichen off the walls and drive the air out of the chamber like a lung collapsing. Long enough for the sound to reach a pitch beyond hearing, a frequency that existed only as pressure against the inside of the skull and a taste of copper at the back of the throat. Long enough for Elara to feel the rune circle beneath her palms go from fractured to dead, the energy draining out of the carved lines like blood from a severed vein, and with it, the connection she had been holding open. The doorway, the gap, the narrow channel through which something enormous and silver and burning with 7 years of caged fury had been clawing its way toward the surface. Gone. The white faded. Darkness replaced it. Total, subterranean, the kind of dark that had weight and texture and pressed against the eyes like wet cloth. Elara was on her side. She did not remember falling. Her palms were raw, not cut but burned, the skin stripped in patches that would blister before morning. Her ears rang with a single sustained note that wiped everything else from the audible spectrum. She pushed herself upright, blinked, waited for her vision to adjust. The chamber was destroyed. The rune circle was a crater, 6 inches deep where the carved lines had been. The stone melted and re-solidified into a rough glass that reflected nothing. Half the ceiling had come down. Rubble covered the floor in chunks ranging from fist-sized to the dimensions of a horse. Dust hung in the air so thick she could barely see the far wall. Draven was on his knees 10 feet from the circle's edge. Blood ran from a gash above his right eye where a piece of falling stone had caught him, and his left arm hung at an angle that suggested something between his shoulder and elbow had been introduced to a force it was not designed to accommodate. He was breathing, hard, through his teeth. Each exhale a sound that was not quite a growl and not quite a groan, but something more primal, the noise a body makes when it is processing damage and deciding whether to continue functioning. Vareth was against the far wall, pinned. A slab of ceiling stone had fallen across his legs below the knee, and his face was the gray-white of a man whose body was informing him of injuries he did not yet have the capacity to fully register. His hand was still extended toward where the failsafe rune had been. The wall beneath it was cracked in a starburst pattern. The rune itself was gone, burned out. A single-use mechanism, spent. The silver pup emerged from behind a pile of rubble near the staircase, dusty, shaking, unharmed. Its gold eyes found Alara across the wreckage, and it picked its way toward her, stepping over broken stone with the careful deliberation of a creature navigating terrain that mattered. Alara gathered the pup against her chest and stood, her legs held, barely. The burns on her palms throbbed with a heat that climbed her wrists and settled in her forearms like embers buried under skin. Draven. He looked up. The blood had reached his jaw and was dripping onto the stone beneath him. His eyes were black pits in the dust-caked mask of his face, but they were focused, present. Whatever the failsafe had done to the chamber, it had not broken the man inside it. "The connection," he said. "Is it gone?" Alara closed her eyes, reached inward, searched for the doorway, the empty bond space that had opened into something vast and silver and alive. She found it, still there, still hollow, but not empty the way it had been before. The walls of it were warm, residual heat, the thermal memory of something that had pressed against them with enough force to leave an imprint. And behind that warmth, faint, fading, but unmistakable, a heartbeat. Not strong, not steady, but present, continuing, refusing. "No," she said, damaged, set back. "But the wolf is still there." The failsafe did not rebuild the prison. It collapsed it. Whatever Vareth did, he destroyed his own mechanism. She looked at Vareth. The counselor's breathing was shallow and rapid. His legs beneath the stone slab were motionless. His eyes were open and tracking her with the desperate intelligence of a cornered animal calculating escape routes from a trap it had built itself. "Then there is no wall," Draven said. "The wall is gone, but so is the channel I was using. The wolf is free inside the space, unbound. But it has been caged for 7 years. It needs a reason to come forward. It needs to know the cage is truly gone." Draven pressed his good hand against the floor and stood. The motion cost him. She could see it in the white flash around his eyes and the breath he held for 3 counts before releasing it through his teeth. He swayed, planted his feet, held. He walked to where Vareth lay pinned. He stood over the man who had been his senior advisor for 12 years, the man who had held the Empire together during the worst crisis of Draven's reign, the man who had solved the problem of a grieving king by imprisoning the only part of him that had the power to heal. "You could have told me," Draven said. His voice was quiet, not the quiet of calm, the quiet of a man who had passed through rage and come out the other side into something colder and more permanent. 7 years ago, you could have told me the truth, that you were afraid of what I was becoming, that the Empire needed stability, that my grief was a threat. I would have listened. You would not have. You did not try. I tried. The first week, I stood in your chambers while you shredded the drapes with your bare hands, and I told you the kingdom needed its king. You threw me through a door. And that justified caging my wolf. That justified doing whatever was necessary to prevent the collapse of an empire that protects 300,000 people. You are one man, Draven, one man's wolf against the stability of an entire civilization. The math is simple. The math is monstrous. The math is governance. Every ruler in history has been diminished so the throne could endure. I diminished you less than most. Draven looked at him for a long time. The dust settled around them in slow spirals. Somewhere above, voices echoed, guards, soldiers, people responding to the tremors that had shaken the fortress to its roots. You are done, Draven said. Your seat, your title, your authority, gone. You will face a tribunal of the full council for conspiracy against the crown. Dren, Halvard, and Morvik will stand beside you. They will deny everything. They will deny everything to a king who can shift. We will see how convincing their denials are when they are standing before the Silver Alpha for the first time in 7 years. He turned away from Vareth, walked back to Alara, stood before her in the ruined chamber with blood on his face and one arm hanging wrong and 7 years of manufactured grief collapsing inside him like a condemned building finally allowed to fall. "Tell me what to do," he said. She looked up at him. The king asking an exile for direction. The most powerful man in the realm standing in the rubble of his own betrayal with nothing left to hide behind and no more illusions to maintain. There was something in his face she had never seen in another living person, the terrifying openness of a man who had been stripped down to the foundation and discovered that the foundation was still solid, still standing, still capable of bearing weight. "Sit down," she said. He sat, on the broken stone, in the dust, without hesitation. She knelt across from him, set the silver pup between them, placed her burned palms on her own knees, and breathed. "The prison is gone, but the silence is not. 7 years of it. Your wolf has been in the dark so long it has forgotten what the other side sounds like. It knows the cage is broken. It does not know yet that the world outside the cage is safe. How do I tell it? You do not tell it anything. Telling is what Vareth did. Commands, instructions, management. You do what I did with every pup that showed up at my door half dead and terrified." She held his gaze. "You stay. You do not push. You do not pull. You do not demand. You make yourself into a place the wolf wants to come back to, and then you wait. I do not know how to wait. You waited 7 years. That was not waiting. That was enduring. Then endure a little longer. But this time, do it without the wall. Do it with everything open, every wound, every failure. Every night you spent pressing against a barrier that never moved. Let the wolf see all of it, not the king, not the alpha, the man underneath, the one Seraphine saw." His jaw tightened at the name, not with grief, or not only with grief, with the particular agony of a man realizing that even his mourning had been stolen from him, that the sorrow he had carried for 7 years had been real, and the prison built from it had been real, and the two had been so intertwined that untangling them would require facing every moment of loss again, this time without the numbness the binding runes had provided as a side effect. But he did not look away. He closed his eyes. Let his shoulders drop. Let the rigid architecture of command and control and royal posture dissolve into something simpler and more human. A man sitting on broken stone, hurting in his body and hurting in his chest, and choosing, for the first time in 7 years, not to armor any of it. Alara placed her hand over his, the burned palm against the scarred knuckles. Contact without demand. Presence without agenda. The silver pup climbed into Draven's lap, pressed its face against his stomach, closed its gold eyes. The chamber was silent, not the silence of suppression, not the manufactured emptiness of a prison designed to muffle what lived inside it. This was the silence that existed between heartbeats, between exhales. The silence that was not absence, but space. Room for something to move into if it chose to. Minutes passed. The voices above grew louder. Boots on stone. The organized urgency of a fortress responding to structural damage. None of it reached the chamber. None of it mattered. Draven breathed. In, out. The rhythm steadied, slowed. His face, which had been clenched against pain and rage, and the seismic rearrangement of everything he thought he knew, gradually softened into something Alara had never seen on it before. Stillness. Not the performed stillness of a king holding court. The real stillness of a man who had stopped fighting the silence and started listening to it. He opened his eyes. They were gold, not dark. Not the black depth that gave nothing away. Gold. Bright, burning, liquid gold, the same color that had stared up at Alara from the face of a silver pup on a bear hide in a cabin at the edge of the world. The shift started in his hands. A ripple under the skin that was not muscle, but something deeper. something reorganizing the relationship between bone and flesh and the thing that lived in the space between them. It spread up his arms, across his shoulders, down his spine. His body did not fight it. For the first time in 7 years, there was nothing to fight. No wall, no cage, no layers of constructed grief standing between the man and the animal that shared his soul. The sound that came from his chest was not a howl, not yet. It was a crack. The sound of ice breaking on a river in spring, deep, structural, resonant with the release of pressure that had been building since before the freeze began. It echoed through the chamber and up through the broken ceiling and out into the corridors of Greyspire, where every wolf in the fortress heard it and answered with a silence of their own. Not the silence of suppression, the silence of attention, of waiting, of witness. Draven shifted, not gradually, not in stages. The transformation was total, a detonation of silver light and mass and power that filled the chamber and pressed against the walls and sent rubble sliding across the floor from the sheer displacement of a body that was no longer human-sized. Where the man had been kneeling, a wolf stood, silver, enormous. A creature the size of a warhorse, its coat burning with a metallic sheen that threw the dust-filtered light back in every direction. Its eyes were gold suns in a silver face, and they held an intelligence that was not human but was not less than human, different, deeper, running on frequencies that language could not reach. The Silver Alpha of Greyspire. Free. The wolf looked at Alara, looked at her burned hands, her dust-covered face, her cracked lips and tangled hair, and the body that had survived 11 years of exile and 3 hours of fighting a grief prison and was still upright, still present, still there. It lowered its massive head, pressed its nose against her chest, against the place where a wolf bond should have lived and where, instead, a doorway existed. Open, warm, humming with the residual echo of a connection that had changed the architecture of both their lives. Alara placed her burned hands on either side of the wolf's face. The fur was hot beneath her fingers. The skull beneath was enormous. The gold eyes, inches from her own, held an expression she had seen before, in the cabin, in the dark, in the face of a silver pup that had crawled across a frozen wilderness to find her. Gratitude. The vast, unspeakable gratitude of a creature that had been buried alive and had finally been dug out. She pressed her forehead against the wolf's muzzle, closed her eyes. Let the heat wash through her. Let it fill the spaces that had been empty for 26 years. Not with a bond. She still had no wolf of her own, but with something that might have been better. Connection without ownership, presence without possession. The knowledge that she was seen fully and completely by something that had searched for her through 7 years of darkness and had never stopped looking. The wolf pulled back, lifted its head, and howled. The sound split the air like a blade drawn across the sky. It started low, a frequency that vibrated in the chest before the ears could register it, and climbed, rising through octaves that human voices could not reach, carrying with it 7 years of silence, 7 years of captivity, 7 years of waiting in a prison made from the worst moment of its life. The howl poured through the broken ceiling and up through the corridors and out through the windows and battlements and towers of Greyspire Fortress, until it hit the open sky and kept going, rolling across the mountains like thunder that would not stop. And across the fortress, the wolves answered. Every bonded wolf in Greyspire threw back its head and joined the sound, a chorus that shook the walls and rattled the iron chandeliers and filled the great hall that had been silent for 7 years with a noise so powerful and so full of life that the people who heard it stopped where they stood and wept without understanding why. Alara stood in the ruins of a binding chamber beneath the fortress, with the Silver Alpha towering beside her and 5 wolf pups pressing against her legs, and the sound of 300 wolves howling above her head, and she understood something she had spent her entire life unable to articulate. She was not broken. She had never been broken. The empty space inside her where a wolf should have lived was not a defect. It was a capacity. A space designed not to hold a wolf of her own, but to hear what other wolves could not say, to sit in the silence that terrified everyone else, to remain when the grief and the darkness and the weight of what had been lost became too much for anyone who carried their own beast to bear. She was the doorway. She had always been the doorway, and every wolf pup that had found its way to her cabin had known it the way wolves knew everything, not through logic, but through the deep, wordless certainty that lived in the marrow of the pack and traveled through bonds that no rune could sever and no counsel could cage. The weeks that followed reshaped Greyspire from the inside out. The tribunal was swift. Vareth, Dren, Halvard, and Morvek stood before the full council in the Great Hall with the Silver Alpha present for the first time in 7 years. The conspirators did not deny their involvement. They could not. The physical evidence was cemented into the foundation of the fortress, and the wolf standing behind the throne with its gold eyes tracking every word they spoke made fabrication feel less like a strategy and more like a death wish. They were stripped of rank, title, and territorial holdings. Exiled to the northern frontier, the same wilderness they had once used as a dumping ground for inconvenient wolves and inconvenient women. The council was rebuilt, slowly, carefully. Draven did not replace the empty seats with loyalists. He filled them with people who had disagreed with him, people who had questioned the old council's decisions and been sidelined for it, captains and administrators and territory leaders who had spent years on the margins because they valued honesty over access. The new council argued constantly. Draven let them. A throne that demanded agreement was a throne built on silence, and he had lived inside silence long enough to know what it cost. The Great Hall was opened, not for a single ceremonial event, but permanently. Doors unbarred, fires lit in hearths that had been cold since Seraphine's death, tables set for anyone who chose to sit. Music returned. Not the formal orchestrated performances of the old court, but rougher, louder, less polished. The sound of people who had been holding their breath for 7 years finally exhaling. Alara did not become queen. Not immediately. Not officially. What she became was something the Empire had no title for. A woman who walked the corridors of the most powerful fortress in the realm with 5 wolf pups at her heels and the respect of every bonded wolf in the territory. Soldiers who would not have spoken to an exile a month earlier stepped aside when she passed. Not from fear, from the bone-deep recognition that the woman who had broken the binding had earned a standing that no council vote or royal decree could confer. She kept her chambers in the East Wing. She kept her routines, was rising before dawn, checking on the pups, walking the grounds in the early cold before the fortress woke. She kept the habits that had kept her alive in exile because survival was not something you graduated from. It was something you carried with you into every new version of your life, a foundation laid in hardship that supported whatever came after. Draven found her one evening on the rampart above the eastern wall. The sun was setting behind the mountains and the sky was stacked in layers of copper and ash and deep violet that made the snow on the peaks glow like something molten. The 5 pups were arranged along the wall beside her, the 2 grays, the black, the brown, and the silver, now nearly twice the size it had been when it arrived at her cabin, and growing with the kind of speed that suggested it had plans for its eventual dimensions. He stood beside her, not touching, not speaking, just present, the way she had taught him to be in the chamber, the way the wolves had taught her to be in the wilderness. The simple, irreducible act of standing next to someone and letting the silence between you be filled with nothing but the fact of shared existence. Vareth was right about one thing, Draven said after a while. Dangerous sentence. The Empire needed stability. After Seraphine died, I was not stable. I was a fire burning out of control, and someone needed to manage the damage. Managing damage is not the same as caging a wolf. No. But understanding why he did it is not the same as forgiving him for it. He paused. I spent 7 years believing the worst thing that happened to me was losing my wife. Now I know the worst thing was being unable to grieve her properly. The binding took even that from me, turned real loss into a weapon, and left me with a grief I could not process because it was not entirely mine anymore. Alara looked at him. The scars on his face caught the dying light. The gash above his eye from the chamber collapse was healing into a new line that would join the others. A map of damage sustained and survived, each mark a record of a moment that could have ended him and did not. And now, she said, now I grieve her, for the first time, properly, without the binding twisting it into something it was not. He exhaled. It hurts more than the 7 years combined, and it is the first honest thing I have felt since she died. She reached over and took his hand, the scarred knuckles against her burned palm. Both healing, neither healed. Two people marked by what they had endured, standing on a wall above an empire they had broken open together, watching the light die over mountains that did not care about kings or exiles or the fragile, stubborn, unreasonable persistence of hope. "I'm going to rebuild the northern outposts," she said. "Staffed stations along the exile routes, places where abandoned pups can be brought instead of driven into the wild to die. That will cost a fortune. You have a fortune." "I do." He looked at her. "Who will run them?" "I will. With people who understand what it means to survive being discarded. There are others like me out there. Wolfless born, feral bonded, anyone the Empire decided was not worth keeping. I intend to find them." "The Council will resist." "The new Council argues about everything. Let them argue about this. I would rather fight a council that disagrees with me than serve one that agrees because it is afraid." The corner of his mouth moved. That fracture, that almost smile she had first seen in a cabin at the edge of the world, when she told a king his secrets were safe because she had no one to tell them to. It was wider now, deeper, less a crack in a mask and more a feature of the face underneath. "You're going to change this empire," he said. "I'm going to make it deserve the wolves that protect it." He turned to her fully. The sunset was behind him now, and his face was in shadow, but his eyes caught the last light. Not gold, not in human form, but carrying the echo of it, the warmth behind the dark. "Stay," he said. "I told you in the cabin. That is not an answer I give on command. I am not commanding. I am asking. The man, not the king. Stay. Not as a guest, not as a project, not as a function, as the woman who heard what no one else could hear and refused to leave when everything told her to." Alara looked at the mountains, looked at the pups lined along the rampart wall, looked at the fortress below them with its open doors and lit fires and the sound of voices carrying across the courtyard for the first time in 7 years. She had spent her whole life surviving, making herself small enough to fit inside the space the world allowed her, measuring every risk against the probability of loss and choosing, always, the path that cost the least and preserved the most. But there was a different kind of survival, the kind that was not about holding on but about letting go, releasing the grip on the small, defended, perfectly calibrated life she had built in exile and stepping into something larger and less certain and infinitely more worth the risk. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "But if you ever cage another wolf, yours or anyone else's, I will tear this fortress down with my bare hands." "I believe you." "You should." The last light left the sky. The stars came out, cold and sharp and numberless above the mountains. Below, in the great hall, the sound of the evening meal rose through the windows and up through the towers and out into the night, where it mixed with the wind and the distant calls of wolves running the perimeter of an empire that was learning, slowly and painfully and with the stubborn grace of all living things, to become something better than what it had been. Draven took Alara's hand properly, not a grasp, not a claim, an offering. His scarred fingers laced through hers, and she let them, and the warmth between their palms was not fire and not magic, and not the binding force of a shifter bond, but something older and simpler and harder to destroy. Choice. Two people who had survived the worst versions of their own lives, choosing to stand together and build something from the wreckage. Not because destiny required it, not because tradition demanded it, because they had looked at each other across the ruins of everything that had failed them and decided that the next thing they built would be worth protecting. The silver pup sat between them on the rampart wall. Its gold eyes caught starlight and held it. Somewhere deep in the fortress, the silver alpha stirred in the space behind Draven's heartbeat, present, awake, listening through a bond restored and a silence finally broken. And across the mountains, answering one another in voices that carried for miles through the frozen dark, the wolves of Greyspire sang. Not in mourning, not in warning, in celebration, the empire endured, the bond was complete, and the woman they had once called nothing stood at the heart of it all, unbroken, unbowed, exactly where she was always meant to be.